The women's suffrage movement was a decade-long fight for the right to vote for women in the United States. It took women nearly 100 years to earn the right to vote, but for African American women, because of white supremacy, the battle to vote was just beginning. Welcome to One Mic. I'm your host, Country Boy. As you can already tell, this episode is about women's suffrage and how African Americans intertwined their right to vote with women's suffrage. I hope you love this. I hope you enjoy this. As always, if you like this, you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page. Also, review us on Apple Podcasts, give us 5 stars, and listen to The Cut for all your Black pop culture needs. The United States women's rights movement was closely aligned with the anti-slavery movement, and before the Civil War, Black and white abolitionists and suffragists joined together for a common cause. Abolitionist organizations in the early 1800s shared members, goals, and methods. During the antebellum period, a group of former enslaved and freed women like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman worked with prominent Black men like Frederick Douglass and cooperated with women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the United States. It was held in July of 1848 in, of all places, Seneca Falls, New York. The meeting launched what would be the women's suffrage movement. The Women's Rights Convention brought together 200 women and 40 men, including well-known feminists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. They came together to make the claim for full citizenship for women. The delegates believed women to be citizens not limited to their roles as wives and mothers. They agreed that American women were their own individuals who deserved their own political identity. In the language of the Constitution, they wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." Elizabeth Cady Stanton would open the convention with a speech stating, "We are assembled in protest of a form of government existing without consent of the governed to declare our right to be as free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as to give man the power to chastise and imprison women, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children that she loves." The convention discussed 11 resolutions for women's rights. The resolutions called for Americans to regard any laws that place women in an inferior position to men as if they called it no force or authority. They called women to have equal rights in the church and equal rights for jobs. Of those 11 resolutions, all passed unanimously except for the 9th resolution, which called for women to have in their words to secure themselves the sacred right to elective franchise, the right to vote. Because the resolution was so divisive, Stanton and Frederick Douglass would give impassioned speeches in the defense of the 9th resolution, and it barely passed. What they didn't know at the time is the 9th resolution would eventually become the cornerstone of the suffrage movement. Throughout the antebellum and Civil War years, the women's rights movement and the Black rights movement were cultivated together, particularly in regards to voting rights. The arguments for women's suffrage became intertwined with debates for the rights of former slaves and what the meaning was of full citizenship. By the late 1860s, the Reconstruction era leaders of both movements disagreed on the relationship between the movements. Even though this conflict existed between the two movements, they officially came together to form the Equal Rights Association in 1866. This organization was designed to combine the resources and energy of the Black and women's suffrage movements together. Their relationship still remained tenuous, with Susan B. Anthony stating in a meeting with Frederick Douglass in 1866, "I would cut off my right arm of mine before I ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." The passage of 2 amendments during Reconstruction further strained this tenuous relationship between the Black and the women's rights movement. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, the first section and the most popular affirmed the rights of new free black men and women. The law stated that everyone born in the United States, including former slaves, were American citizens, and no state could pass a law that took away their rights to life, liberty, or property. The second section of the 14th Amendment was the most problematic. It added the first mention of gender into the Constitution. It declared that all males over the age of 21 should be able to vote. The insertion of the word male into the Constitution represented a brand new challenge for women's rights. For the first time, the Constitution asserted that men, not women, had the right to vote. Prior to this, only states had restricted the right to vote to men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton would say, if the word male to be inserted in the Constitution, it will take us at least a century to remove it. With the passage of the 14th Amendment, it caused women's suffrage groups to move away from the Republican Party and the political system as a whole over what they perceived to be a betrayal. Meanwhile, black suffragists moved themselves more closely to the Republican Party. At the time, the Republican Party was the more progressive of the two parties, with the Democratic Party being decidedly more conservative. White suffragists did attempt to court the Democratic Party for legislative support, but the Democratic Party would not officially support women's suffrage movement and would only offer support in an attempt to discredit Republican support for black suffrage. The women's rights movement would essentially completely disassociate itself from the entire political process. In contrast of the actions of the women's suffrage movement, the black rights movement would move more closely to the Republican Party, and in turn, they would be more vocal in their support of black suffrage. Ironically, the black suffrage movement felt that combining the two movements together would deplete support for both, and that the goal of black suffrage was more easily obtainable during the Reconstructive era. This caused black activists to move more towards the Republican Party and distance themselves from the women's rights movement. During the final meeting of the American Equal Rights Association in 1869, the debate caused by issues of the 14th Amendment completely destroyed any desire for cooperation between the two movements. Frederick Douglass debated that the issue of race was more urgent of the two causes. Douglass would say the black man needs suffrage to protect his life and property and to ensure him respect and education. Black male suffrage was portrayed as not only as a political right, but a physical necessity. Despite this, most women suffragists were unwilling to postpone women's suffrage for a black man. The women's suffrage leadership was no longer interested in fighting for the enfranchisement of men who they considered to be inferior, and black suffragists didn't see the point in devoting resources to a movement they perceived as lacking political support and overall relevance. Without the mutual respect for the two groups, the American Equal Rights Association was doomed. When the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, which granted black men the right to vote but made no reference to sex as a protected class, women suffragists were livid. They bitterly fought over whether they should support or oppose the 15th Amendment. Women rights activists Stanton and Susan B. Anthony objected to the new law because it enfranchised black males while leaving white women disenfranchised. They wanted to be included with black men in the 15th Amendment. While Lucy Stone supported the amendment because she felt that black men needed the right to vote more than women, not just because it was a step in the right direction for equality, but because it was a matter of life and death for black men. This debate finally caused the Equal Rights Association to rip itself apart. The split between the two factions, with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton forming the National Women's Suffrage Association and Lucy Stone forming the American Women's Suffrage Association. The collapse of the Equal Rights Association was a symbol of the split between women's suffrage and black suffrage. After the split of the two suffrage organizations, they used completely different strategies to gain the right to vote. The more militant and all-female National Women's Suffrage Association was purely focused on women's enfranchisement, apart from equal rights and what they called manhood suffrage. They demanded that the 16th Amendment enfranchised citizens without regards to sex. They felt that women should focus on challenging the 14th Amendment by attempting to vote and forcing the debate in the courts, while focusing on state-level voting rights and then moving towards an eventual constitutional amendment. While the American Women's Suffrage Association continued to work with both males and females for equal rights of both races and sexes in a similar vein to the abolitionist movement. They would continue to support the 15th Amendment and universal suffrage while focusing on gaining women's right to vote at a state level and petitioning Congress to support a constitutional amendment. At this time, the National Women's Suffrage Association decided to employ more complex strategies to promote women's enfranchisement. Suffrage leaders formulated a legal strategy which argued that voting was one of the privileges and impunities of citizenship protected by the 14th Amendment. From 1868 to 1872, hundreds of black and white women suffragists registered and voted, hoping to bring the issue to the courts. Officials arrested some of these women while they filed suits and were charged with the crime. In 1874, the United States Supreme Court unanimously determined that the 14th Amendment was not intended to guarantee women's suffrage. It marked a serious setback not just for women's suffrage movement, but for the black suffrage movement, and caused a refocused attention on a federal amendment. With the Compromise of 1877, this was a formal agreement between Southern Democrats and allies of Republican Rutherford Hayes to settle the result of the 1876 presidential election. But the major impact was the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. This marked the official end of Reconstruction. Southern states created elaborate segregation and disenfranchisement measures, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clause, criminal laws that stripped convicted felons of their voting rights, and the Supreme Court upheld them all as constitutional. Southern Democrats argued that black disenfranchisement was necessary to stop the honest vote of the white man from being offset by some Negro. In post-Reconstruction, state governments created institutionalized white supremacy, and most black men in the South were disenfranchised once again. While the 14th and 15th Amendment pitted white women and black men against each other, it continued to leave black women on the sidelines for the fight for voting rights. However, black women still became members of both suffrage groups. Black abolitionist Hattie Purvis was a delegate for the National Women's Suffrage Association, and prominent black suffragists Charlotte Fortentine and Joseph St. Pierre Ruffin both joined the American Women's Suffrage Association. The importance of race was reflected in the outlook of African American women. While black women did join both suffrage groups, they also developed an extensive club movement. Black women suffragists operated in black communities in cities mostly outside of the main suffrage movement, in part because some suffrage groups, particularly those in the South, didn't allow black women, but also because black women suffragists continued to support universal suffrage while white women mostly campaigned for their own right to vote. Still, black women would push for the reenfranchisement of black males in the South while continuously working tirelessly for their own suffrage. Meanwhile, the National Women's Suffrage Association would press Congress to pass the 16th Amendment for women's suffrage. Their proposal simply said the rights of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied in the United States on account of sex. The tide was changing. There had been increased support for the belief that a woman's place was in the home and she shouldn't be involved in politics, and males' attitudes towards women's suffrage was becoming somewhat more respectable. So when Susan B. Anthony was asked to address the Senate Select Committee about the 16th Amendment, she quickly agreed, but she realized the flaw in her argument. Women's suffrage would have more success if women supported one party or the other, but as it stood, neither party had much to gain from women's suffrage. Many Southern senators worried that giving white women the right to vote would force them to also give the right to vote to black women. Not surprisingly, the 16th Amendment failed in 1887. Progress towards women's suffrage was very slow in the period after the split of the American Equal Rights Association and the failure of the 16th Amendment, but there had been dramatic growth in all-female social reform organizations. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, formed in 1873, the temperance movement was against the consumption of alcoholic beverage, and the WCTU wanted to create a sober and pure world by abstinence, purity, and evangelical Christianity. They felt alcohol was the cause of larger social problems. By 1890, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was the largest women's organization in the country, with almost 250,000 members and chapters in just about every state. Many black suffragists were also very active in the temperance movement. They would argue that intemperance was a major obstacle to racial advancement, and the passage of federal women's suffrage would significantly reduce this and other African American social ills. These ideals would cause the WCTU to endorse women's suffrage on the grounds that women needed the right to vote to protect their families from alcohol and other vices. This support caused a major boost in the growth of women's suffrage. As friction between the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association began to dissipate, the issues that had once divided the two organizations, like representation, universal suffrage, and the direction of the movement, didn't seem as important as they had in the past. By the October 1887 convention of the American Women's Suffrage Association, President Lucy Stone proposed that the two organizations explore a merger. After some discussion between the two groups, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was created in February 18th of 1890. They met in Washington with a convention that officially merged the two organizations, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton as president and Susan B. Anthony as VP. This reconsolidation would drive women's suffrage into the political mainstream. Activists took advantage of the growing club and temperance movement to draw thousands of women into their ranks. They branded women's suffrage as moderate and non-controversial. The National American Women's Suffrage Association downplayed the support of blacks and also didn't publicize its female membership because it was important to secure support from Southern Jim Crow states for a federal amendment. Also supported any politician from either party who supported women's suffrage and wouldn't take any position on any controversial political issue of the day. But despite all the work done by black suffragists, the mainstream suffrage movement was moving towards radical discrimination practices and even condoned white supremacist ideology in order to garner support for white women voting. In 1895, Susan B. Anthony, as veteran of the women's suffrage movement, Frederick Douglass not to attend the NAWSA convention in Atlanta. She would later explain that Douglass' presence on stage with honored guests would have offended their Southern hosts. White women suffragists chose speed over loyalty and justice when it came to black suffragists. And by 1903, the National American Women's Suffrage Association officially adopted a new platform of women's rights. This platform was designed to bring Southern suffrage groups into the fold. This platform essentially nullified the issue of black rights and acknowledged that the National American Women's Suffrage Association considered white women's suffrage to be the organization's primary goal. With the National American Women's Suffrage Association's platform to recruit Southern women into its ranks, and Southerners felt that state-by-state argument aimed at excluding black women was the answer. As a result, national women's suffrage leaders expressed fear that any inclusion of black women would create racial tension among their Southern members and jeopardize the 19th Amendment. Consequently, they decided to discourage black women from joining the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It was at this point that the NAWSA also developed a strategy to ask states to legislate a literacy requirement to voting. It was called educated suffrage. It was used to not only limit black people, but immigrants and working class voters. This tactic actually worked to impede their cause because it limited the amount of supporters from the white working class. More Southern, conservative, middle-class white suffragists felt that downplaying blacks and working class voters would work to recruit more support from males. They claimed that black men and black women were a threat to the success of white women's suffrage movements, and most suffrage leaders attempted to move forward with their movement without African American women. They worked to write black women out of their state and federal proposals, and black activists vowed to continue their struggle for the right to vote and criticize white women for their discrimination. Despite discrimination that black women experienced, black women formed their own local and regional suffrage clubs. In 1898, the National Association for Colored Women, the NACW, provided black women with a national platform to advocate for women's suffrage and women's rights causes. The organization, its inception throughout the 20th century, fought for women's suffrage, sharing their pro-suffrage sentiments and activities at regional and national conventions. The NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois gave intensive coverage to black women's suffrage struggle. He wrote articles in the Crisis in favor of women's suffrage and acknowledged the racism in the women's movement was a problem. W.E.B. Du Bois' argument was that women and African Americans shared the same issues and that they should have the right to vote because justice demanded it. NAACP leader Mary B. Talbert wrote in the Crisis an article in 1915 called Women and Colored Women. As Talbert would point out, with us colored women, the struggle was twofold. First, we are women, and second, we are colored women. Ida B. Wells was also one of the founders of the NAACP, and she stated that the movement was inextricably linked to her lifelong crusade against racism, violence, and discrimination towards African Americans. Like all suffragists, she believed in women's right to vote, but she also saw enfranchisement as a way for black women to become more politically involved in their communities and also use their vote to elect African Americans, regardless of their gender, to political office. In 1913, Ida B. Wells also organized the first women's suffrage group in Illinois, the Chicago-based Alpha Suffrage Clubs. She organized and participated in nonpartisan NAWSA, NACW, and Alpha Club campaigns and political rallies. On the eve of the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson in 1913, protesters launched a massive suffrage parade in the nation's capital called the Women's Suffrage Processional. Organized by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, it was the first organized march on Washington for political purposes in American history. They had between 5,000 and 10,000 marchers. The NAWSA leaders believed that including blacks in the march was a bad idea and seriously considered excluding blacks from the procession. Alice Paul wanted to keep information about the group's feelings about black marchers out of the press. But one newspaper with account indicated that Alice Paul stated that the participation of Negroes would have a most disastrous effect by angering white Southerners doubly leery of women's suffrage and the enfranchisement of the black population. The NAWSA insisted that the official stance was to permit Negroes to march if they cared to, but on the day of the march, the head of the NAWSA, Ann Howard Shaw, wanted to keep the delegations entirely white and asked black women suffragists, including Ida B. Wells, to walk at the end of the parade with the colored delegation. Instead of going back with the other colored women, Ida would wait with the spectators as the parade got underway and stepped in with the white delegation as they passed by. The National Association for Colored Women's founder, Mary Church Terrell, did march with the all-black delegation. Terrell told the NAACP that she denounced the anti-black stance of Alice Paul and other white women suffrage leaders. She believed that if white suffrage leaders could pass an amendment without black women, they would. This accommodating acquiescence to white racism exemplified the worsening racial climate within the suffrage movement. By 1916, both political parties endorsed women's suffrage, but only at a state level, which meant that states could implement women's suffrage how they saw fit and not at all. Expecting more, this caused the National American Women's Suffrage Association to begin a renewed plan or push for a federal amendment. National American Women's Suffrage Association President Carrie Chapman Catt delivered a speech called The Crisis, in which she revealed what she called the winning plan to focus on the NAWSA's efforts on a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women's right to vote. This plan mandated that a national suffrage amendment was the priority of the entire organization and authorized the creation of a professional lobbying team to support that cause in the Capitol. President Woodrow Wilson's attitude towards women's suffrage was changing. He actually spoke at the 1916 National American Women's Suffrage Association Convention, and he was considered an opponent of women's suffrage when he was governor of New Jersey. But in 1915, he announced that he was traveling from the White House to his home state to vote in favor of the New Jersey state referendum. He spoke favorably of suffrage at the NAWSA convention, but stopped short of supporting a national suffrage amendment. But by 1918, President Woodrow Wilson had further aligned himself with women's voting rights through the influence of Carrie Chapman Catt. President Wilson would deliver a speech pleading for the passage of women's voting legislation as an emergency measure and argued that the full support of women's groups was an essential component of the anti-war effort and cited the increased role of women played in the anti-war effort. When the amendment came up for vote in 1918, Wilson addressed the Senate for women's suffrage. Wilson would state, "I regard the extension of suffrage to women as a vital essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged." Despite Wilson's support, the amendment failed in the Senate by just 2 votes. Another year would pass before Congress would take up the measure again. In May 21st, 1919, House Representative James R. Mann proposed to the House a resolution that would approve the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. The measure passed the House by the required 2/3 majority, and 2 weeks later, the U.S. Senate passed the 19th Amendment by just 2 votes over the 2/3 majority required. The amendment was sent to the states for ratification. By March of the following year, a total of 35 states had approved the amendment, just shy of the 3/4 required for ratification. The issue lay with southern states who were adamantly opposed to the amendment. 7 states, including Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, and South Carolina and Virginia, had already rejected the amendment. Tennessee took up the vote on August 18th of 1920, and it was up to Tennessee to tip the scales in favor of women's suffrage. The outlook was not very good. Given the outcome in other southern states, the result was Tennessee state legislators were locked in a 48-48 tie. The decision came down to a 23-year-old representative, Harry T. Burns. The Republican would cast a deciding vote. He was actually opposed to the amendment, but his mother convinced him to approve it. Allegedly, Harry T. Burns' mother wrote her son stating, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Miss Catt put the rat in ratification." On August 26th of 1920, the 19th Amendment was certified and added to the Constitution. The amendment read that the rights of citizens of the United States shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. The 19th Amendment extended the right to vote to between 26 million and 30 million women, making it the single largest expansion of voting rights in U.S. history. On November 2nd, more than 8 million white and black women would successfully cast their ballot. But in southern states, black women would encounter the same disenfranchisement strategies and anti-black violence that led to the disenfranchisement of black men and continued to keep black women disenfranchised well after the 19th Amendment. Worried about black women voting, state legislators went so far as to change the laws to keep the doors locked. In places like Mississippi, lawmakers changed the poll taxes to require the same poll taxes of $2 for women as required of men. In Savannah, officials imposed a letter of the law concluding that many Negro women had registered since suffrage movement amendment came effective. Election judges ruled that they were not so entitled to vote because state law required registration to be 6 months before the election. This ruling meant that no woman in the state of Georgia could vote because too little time had passed between the ratification of the 19th Amendment and Election Day. After 1920, several states imposed grandfather clauses to ensure that descendants of disenfranchised slaves who were now free could not vote. Other states subjected voters to literacy tests, which local officials administered differently to black versus white voters. And so-called understanding clauses demanded that potential voters read, then explain the text that they had just read. It was just another requirement that disproportionately disenfranchised black Americans. When voters did overcome these hurdles, they often learned that they had accumulated years of unpaid poll taxes, which had to be paid before they could cast their ballot. These obstacles would spark a decades-long push for equal rights to the ballot for black communities, with civil rights activists making voting rights key to their fight for racial justice. As with the larger suffrage movement, black women continue to take a leading role in unfettered access to voting. These efforts would culminate in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, legislation that finally secured the right to vote for black people. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 brought promises of the 15th and 19th Amendment to reality for Black people whose votes has been suppressed by discriminatory tactics. For Black women, the right for suffrage was a multifaceted effort closely linked to the fights for equality in Black community. Racism and other discriminatory tactics within women's rights organizations and suffrage campaigns and anti-Black racial violence forced Black women early on to link their right to vote with Black suffrage and civil rights activism. Black women's fight for equal rights from the antebellum period to the opening decades of the 20th century helped define their post-19th Amendment ratification political activism. Following the 19th Amendment, the battle for the right to vote ended for white women, but for African Americans, the outcome was less clear. Hoping to combat anti-Black violence and the disenfranchisement of Black men, particularly in the South, Black women engaged in politics and activism and expanded post-1920. The 19th Amendment was just a starting point for Black women's involvement in politics. Black women's suffrage struggles in the United States was just one part of a long, impressive history of African American women's political engagement. Black women were always the ones sitting at the table, tirelessly creating the vision, the policy, and the mobilization for African Americans in our fight for equal rights. Thank you. This has been One Mic, a Black History podcast. If you like this and enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page. Please consider donating to our Patreon page so we can continue to bring you dope content. Also review us on Apple Podcasts. Give us 5 stars, and listen to the cut for all your Black pop culture needs. And peace.